Hi, my name is Steph Smart. I grew up on a cattle property outside of Cloncurry in far northwest Queensland, where my family still are. February 2019 will unfortunately be a time that they will never forget, as they, like so many of our friends and people in the surrounding communities, were impacted by a weather event that will affect them not only financially, but emotionally for many years to come. Not knowing how to support my family and friends going through this, I contacted a friend of mine, Paul Blackburn, who is an expert in emotional and mindset mastery. I knew Paul had extensive experience not only working with individuals, but entire communities after natural disasters and traumatic events. Being the kind of bloke Paul is, he said he would love to help out his fellow Australians, and he suggested that we pull together some practical tools and resources to help people help their family and friends and their communities get through the challenges that they are facing, such as what has happened in far north Queensland. So thank you, Paul. I really appreciate your time that you've given us to do this.
No worries. If we can just help one person, that'd be great.
Absolutely.
Let alone help a bunch of them.
So can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Paul, and the experience that you've had working with natural disaster and trauma?
Well, I started out as a high school teacher in the western suburbs of Sydney, so that's got nothing to do with the bush, but very quickly we ended up living in the bush ourselves, and my wife and I and our kids, and I happened to be on the spot when the 2003 Canberra bushfires came through. For those who don't remember the details, 500 houses burnt to the ground, 3 people were killed. Pretty monumental kind of a disaster, and I was involved in helping the people who had not just houses but businesses go down at that point. So the government got me to come in and help with basically the emotional trauma and the mindset that you need for recovery.
Yep.
And that was a difficult time for everybody. Difficult to watch, difficult to be in. No one was a winner in that kind of a thing. But I learnt a lot about how to help people on a larger scale, which is why we're sitting here today. I've learned a few things that if we can pass them on to everybody, it's just going to help them, not just help themselves, but help the people around them, because these things are going to be around for a long time. February 2019 probably going to be remembered for more than a generation. It's probably going to take more than a generation to recover.
Yep.
And a lot of that recovery is, we can measure the financial recovery. What you don't see is emotional damage and the lives that are set back, and the things that kids pick up because mum and dad are under pressure or stress or not coping well. Not that we would expect anybody to cope well, but there are ways that we can do a bit better than if we just left to our own devices.
Yep. And so the motivation for pulling these tools and resources together for me initially was to help my family and friends with what they were facing up north after the flooding and the weather event. But the reality is there are so many people in rural Australia hurting right now. So whether it's droughts, fires, floods, locust plagues, animal activism, there are a lot of people hurting in our country right now, and it's not just the people on the land. The flow-on effect is huge, and it's often a lot of the businesses and people in the rural communities that are really suffering as well.
Yeah, really difficult because, the peripherals, around a community. So say, for example, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, the hairdresser, all of those people suffer because, people who've been through this kind of trauma are going to pull back in every kind of a way. They're going to be less open about everything, but they're certainly not going to open their wallets as quickly when they know there's nothing in there. So that means that all those businesses now are going to, their turnover is going to drop dramatically. Some of them will be borderline themselves, and so they may not have actually lost, hundreds of thousands of cattle and all the other things we see on the news, but equally they have a business just goes under. Unpredictably, out of the blue, what was a good business suddenly isn't, not viable. And
the sense of responsibility, I'm a business owner in the agricultural industry, and that sense of responsibility to the people that you employ, that's a really big burden to carry.
For many people, the guilt and the shame of having to sack someone because we can't pay them is far greater than the personal guilt and shame about the business going under. And, it's probably true, and part of the Australian spirit is we go, okay, well, that happened to me, I'll cope with it. But poor old Jack who worked for me,
Yep.
I had to sack him, and I'll never feel good about that.
Yep.
And so that's a difficult thing to deal with in amongst everything else,
Yep.
because you've got everything kind of quietens down, and so the whole economy, region-wise, just takes a beating, and everybody takes a beating along with that.
Absolutely. So, Paul, what we've done just after, it was just really a general conversation that we had. You suggested that we pull together some tools and resources to better equip people that are, facing these challenges, especially in our rural communities. It's obviously, these tools and resources are universal, and they can be applied to many different sectors. So we've come up with 5 main topics.
Yep.
The first topic we've come up with is shock. So
Yep.
can you tell us a little bit about what we're going to talk about there?
Sure. Shock comes in 2 forms. There's the shock of an overnight event.
Yep.
There's also the shock of a long-term build-up thing.
Yep.
So one of the things we could say is, if you were going to get cancer and it was going to take 3 years to take you out, would you want to know now, or
Yep.
would you not want to know? And so the people who say, I'd rather know so that I could maximise that last 3 years, that's one way of handling difficult situations. Other people say, no, I'd rather not know. I'd rather, live till the end and then boom, I'm out. What it means is that for the people who handle shock best, if they've got some warning,
Yep.
then they're really traumatised right now because there was no warning for this event. For the people who would rather not have a warning, they're probably on the outside at least coping a little better because it's turned up, they turn practical. They say, okay, well, that's bad, but what have I got to do now, and how do I get on with it? And they've got a list of jobs a mile long, and they're getting on with it. So those 2 forms of handling shock, we need to talk about them in some.
Okay.
A bit
So
more
essentially what you're talking about there is the shock without a lead up is what has happened in far northwest Queensland, like a natural disaster that's come out of the blue that you've had no control over.
Yeah.
That's just caught you completely off guard. But the longer term shock that you are also referring to is I guess people that have been suffering through the ongoing drought.
Yeah. So if we go back to the cancer analogy, the drought is kind of like, every day you can get up and say your prayers and hope for rain, get disappointed again. So that builds up, and over a period of time what you see is that people who handle the first few years of a drought start to not handle it so well. Years 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 is like, I don't know how people handle that. So that long-term endurance, it's like the marathon runner. There's some people who are built for running a marathon and others are sprinters, and you can't really get them to swap around. So we have to know how to cope with that. So they're the 2 forms. The slow build-up, some people prefer it. Nobody's going to prefer a drought, but you know what I mean. Other people would just rather handle the shock. So we have both of those in natural disasters. We have them also in our own lives. And so if we took it outside the rural community, then you'd see that, we can have Fred who catches some disease and takes 5 years to take him out. We can have Marianne who gets killed in a car smash. They're versions of, they're both shock, and they're both difficult to deal with, and we would prefer none of that to happen. Practically speaking, everybody who's watching us now will have had an example of both.
Yep. And so we have our natural disasters, and we also have unnatural disasters as well.
Yeah, and the unnatural disasters, we want to fix them.
Yep.
So we want the animal activists to all piss off somewhere else. We want people killed in car smashes. We want to fix the road so that doesn't happen. So you'll see that mobs like governments get involved in saying, okay, we're going to put a speed limit on the road. That's supposed to do something about the road toll, that kind of thing. So where there are things which are preventable, we want to prevent them if we can, but they're difficult to implement. Not everybody reacts the same way. As soon as you say, there's a speed limit on this road, there are people who want to break the speed limit. There are people who say, well, we can't go any faster than that.
Yep.
Individual reactions to everything is pretty much what we need to cover.
Okay. So that's shock.
Yep.
The second topic we're going to talk about is why people behave the way that they do.
Yeah, and pretty much that's related to the first one, so
Yep.
it's just as well we made it number 2. But essentially, why I react to something differently to you comes from my expectations of how I think I can cope with it, and how much difficulty I think I've got. For example, I might assume that I should be doing fine because my mate down the road, the devastation was double for him what it was for me. So I'm going to react differently, even if I'm good at it.
Yep.
I'm still going to be kind of behind the 8 ball a little bit. Men react quite differently to women. So women understand talk it out to work it out. Men understand work it out, then do something.
Yep.
And so women quite often struggle with men because, they say he won't talk to me or he doesn't know how he feels. He does. But he's trying to figure out the answer and he wants
Yep.
to deliver the answer. Men are, driven by the need to fix things and make things right and make things happen. Women understand that if we can talk it out to work it out, we might find a better solution.
Okay.
So that's a difference. That's a gender difference. But then there's differences between all women and all men in terms of what gets us, what nails us, and what doesn't.
Okay. So then the third topic we're going to cover is how to help your mates.
Yeah. And mostly that's about finding that delicate balance between interfering and yet being there to support. So even the language we use, the things that we do, there are things that we can do. Most people do something out of all good intentions, but it's actually just dumb as dog shit when they do it. And when we say, the person that I went to help was all insulted, then we get insulted that they were insulted when in actual fact we just didn't understand how how we need to relate to them.
Yep.
So, you'll find all sorts of warfare amongst people who shouldn't be at war because there is just difficulty in communicating and how each individual prefers their communication coming to them.
And I guess one of the main reasons that we wanted to pull together these tools, especially for up north and what people are facing around Australia, there are lots of mental health initiatives out there and some very good ones. But I guess initially for a lot of those people, especially up north, they are limited by distance. So to actually physically go and speak to someone or, having the time to do that is often difficult. There are barriers there. So we thought that this just might be a tool that people may get some ideas of how they can just help support their loved ones or friends or people in the community. And, they can do it by listening while they're, driving between properties or on the tractor. Just a way that they can get some form of help without, obviously it's not going to take the place of seeing a professional if they need to see a professional, but it just might give them some practical tools and resources.
Well, I think that most communities have to sort this stuff out themselves because there's not enough of the professionals out there. So essentially how you help your mates means you have to understand what makes them tick.
Yep.
That means that you can't help hundreds of people, but there's probably a dozen people you can make a solid impact on their life because I can say this to Fred, but I can't say it to Jack.
Yep.
And so if I'm going to say the same thing to Jack, I'll put in different words and know how to do that. Recognising the signs of stress and drama are probably the main things we need to know because most people in rural communities are just going to be busy getting on with it. And so it's a bit of a trap. Being busy getting on with it can allow me to get all of my trauma and just shove it down. And, there's a bit of a belief out there that says that, you've got to do that anyway. And who needs to pussyfoot around with all this talking stuff when there's work to be done? So that means that we might actually have lots of people who are suffering but not saying so.
Yep.
And being able to recognise the signs where someone's actually struggling but looking okay, that's a really important ingredient for us.
Absolutely. Okay, the next topic we're covering is managing your emotions and theirs.
So first of all, we need to know how to manage ours. We've got to do a lot more than just get on with it.
Yep.
Once we are capable of handling what we are suffering from or what we are struggling with, and that doesn't matter whether it's a blue with your spouse or whether it's something that went drastically wrong on your work today or the fact that you just broke something that's going to cost $100,000 to fix. All of those things trigger emotions.
Yep.
And those emotions need to be expressed in a way that works for the person who's doing it, doesn't damage anyone else around them, In other words, it might be fine if you split the dummy and blow a gasket, but if that doesn't work for your spouse, then we've got marital issues that were not there before. So that means we need to know how we operate. We need to be better at operating our own emotions, make our emotions serve us instead of running us.
Yep.
It's no good to say, "Oh, bugger it, I'm sorry if I hurt you, but I had a bad day," because you're still hurt.
Yep.
So the old excuse of "I had a bad day" or "I couldn't help it's no longer viable. Just doesn't work well. So we need to know how to handle ourselves. We also need to know how to respond appropriately so that we actually facilitate the well-being of other people who are going to be struggling with their emotions and don't have the education that we're trying to provide here.
Okay, great. And the last topic we're covering is recovery. So what comes after the natural disaster or traumatic event?
In most disasters, and remember, we could be talking to somebody who's just lost a loved one in a car smash. It's just as relevant now. So when it comes to recovery, most people struggle because it's actually the longest part of the journey. We can say that the event, a month after it, we can say, okay, so the floods happened in February. Now we're in March. We can say a month after that, it's kind of like the floods are all gone. The damage is just lying around everywhere. Recovery for many people, minimum 10 years, perhaps longer. That's going to require serious levels of personal endurance, ability to withstand things going worse because, who says the banks are going to play ball on this whole kind of a thing? The government says they're sending money, but we'll believe that when we see it. The volunteers are going to go home. So, Blaze Aid doing an amazing job, but sooner or later all those volunteers have got to take care of their families. And so, it's a little bit like a funeral. Everybody turns up and you get a lot of support while the funeral's on and maybe a day or two later. But after that, certainly a week or two later, everyone's gone home and they're all 1,000 clicks away. And there we are, basically naked, wondering how we cope, and yet what the world is diametrically different, never going to be the same again.
Yep.
And for many of the people we're talking to, it's never going to be the same again.
Yep.
And recovery will be a massively long period of time. So we need to know how to cope with that. There are strategies that work in recovery and strategies that don't.
Yep.
So
Okay.
we'll talk about them.
Excellent. All right, let's get into it.
Okay.